When you open the New Testament, the story of Jesus begins in the wrong place. If you were engineering a movement to change the world, especially a religious movement meant to fulfill centuries of ancient Jewish prophecy, you would start at the center of power. You would go to Jerusalem. You would stand in the city of David, the historic heart of the nation. You would launch your campaign from the massive stone steps of the temple, surrounded by scribes, priests, and Torah scholars who had spent their entire lives studying the sacred texts. That was the center of biblical gravity. That is where the ultimate king was supposed to declare his arrival. But Jesus does not start there. He walks right past the religious establishment. He bypasses the polished marble of the temple courts. He leaves the holy city behind, turning his back on the center of power, and he heads north. He goes to a region called Galilee. For most modern readers, Galilee is just a geographic detail. It is a convenient, peaceful backdrop filled with rolling green hills, wooden fishing boats, and quiet waters. We tend to view it as a simple, pastoral setting for a gentle teacher. It feels like nothing more than the hometown where Jesus happened to grow up. But that is not how a first-century Jewish reader saw it. To the religious leaders of the first century, Galilee was not a peaceful retreat. It was an insult. It was the absolute edge of the map. It was the dark margin of the nation. It was a place where the religious elites assumed God had stopped working a long time ago. To say that the promised Messiah would begin his work in Galilee was like saying the true king of the world would rise from a forgotten, dusty border town filled with outcasts. It was a geographic scandal. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, the text tells us that when Jesus heard John the Baptist had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee. He did not go to the capital to fight the religious power structure. He did not gather an army of scholars in the holy city. He retreated to the borders. This was not an accident, and it was not simply a matter of convenience. The geography of Jesus' ministry is actually the theology of his ministry. Where he begins tells us exactly how his kingdom operates. Jesus is intentionally establishing a pattern. It is a profound, quiet architecture of grace that runs through the entire Bible. The pattern is this: God's ultimate work of restoration almost never begins at the center of human power. It does not launch from the places of assumed perfection, heavy influence, or religious pride. It begins at the broken, overlooked, and compromised edges. Jerusalem was the center of purity. Galilee was considered contaminated. Jerusalem was the city of kings and priests. Galilee was the land of dirt roads, Roman outposts, uncredentialed laborers, and deeply mixed populations. The religious experts in the south looked down on anyone from the north. They believed that nothing truly holy could ever emerge from a place so completely fractured. They assumed the region was spiritually dead. But to understand why this choice was so scandalous, and why the religious center held such a deep, historical prejudice against the northern region, we have to look at what the word Galilee actually means. We have to uncover the ancient trauma buried in the soil of this land, a history that most people reading the Gospels have completely forgotten. To understand why the religious center of Jerusalem looked down on Galilee, we have to look at the map, and we have to look at the original language. The name Galilee comes from the Hebrew root word Galil. It is a simple word. It means a circle, a circuit, or a region. But in the Hebrew scriptures, this area is not just called Galilee. The prophet Isaiah gives it a much longer, much more descriptive title. He calls it Galil HaGoyim, the Galilee of the Gentiles, the circle of the nations. That title was not a compliment. It was a description of compromise. Think about the geography of Jerusalem. The holy city was built on a mountain. It was elevated, fortified, and geographically isolated. It was difficult to reach. This made it easier to protect from invading armies, but also easier to protect from foreign influence. Jerusalem was built to remain pure. Galilee was the exact opposite. It was not a fortress, it was a crossroads. Major international trade routes ran right through the middle of the Galilean hills. The most famous was the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea, which connected Egypt in the south to the massive empires of the north and east. Because of these roads, Galilee was never a closed, insulated Jewish community. It was a doorway to the known world, and that doorway was always open. Roman legions marched on Galilean stone. Greek merchants sold goods in Galilean markets. Syro-Phoenician caravans passed through daily, bringing foreign money, foreign ideas, and foreign gods. The air in Galilee was filled with conversational Greek and Aramaic, not just the sacred, ceremonial Hebrew guarded by the southern scholars. To the priests, scribes, and Pharisees living in Judea, this made Galilee permanently unclean. They viewed the region as hopelessly compromised. It was too close to the pagan world. Its borders were too porous. Its people were too mixed. The religious elite assumed that Galileans were uneducated, unsophisticated, and careless with the law of Moses. They were the blue-collar, rough-around-the-edges believers who could not be trusted with deep theological truth. But Jesus looks at this exact same geography and sees something completely different. Where the religious center saw a contaminated borderland, Jesus saw a staging ground. By anchoring his life and his teaching in the circle of the Gentiles, Jesus is making a quiet, profound statement about the nature of his kingdom. The kingdom of God is not going to be a walled fortress. It is not going to be quarantined in the holy city, strictly guarded by religious gatekeepers. It is going to bleed out into the nations. If you want to reach the entire world, you do not launch your movement in a locked room at the top of a mountain. You start at the crossroads. You start where the nations are already walking. This is the first piece of the pattern. God begins his work in the places that religion considers too compromised to be useful. But there is a deeper layer to this story. Galilee was not just marginalized because of its geography. It was not just looked down upon because of its mixed population or its heavy Roman presence. It carried a historic trauma. There was a wound buried deep in the soil of this northern region. A scar from an event that shattered the nation 700 years before Jesus ever walked along the water. To understand why Jesus had to begin in this exact location, we have to look back at the darkest moment in Israel's history. Long before the Romans paved their roads, and long before Greek merchants set up their markets, the region of Galilee was the ancestral home of two specific Israelite tribes. When Joshua divided the Promised Land among the children of Israel, the northernmost territory was given to the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali. It was a beautiful, fertile region, stretching from the green hills down to the Sea of Galilee. But geographically, it was a highly dangerous place to live. Because Zebulun and Naphtali were at the absolute northern edge of the map, they were the most vulnerable to attack. Whenever a massive empire from the north decided to march against Israel, these two tribes were the first ones to be hit. They were the buffer zone. They were the shield of the nation, and they took the heaviest blows. In the 8th century before Christ, the ultimate disaster struck. The Assyrian Empire, one of the most ruthless military machines in the ancient world, swept down from the north like a flood. 2 Kings chapter 15 records the invasion of the Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser III. He did not just defeat the northern tribes in battle. The Assyrians used a terrifying military strategy to break the spirit of the nations they conquered: mass deportation. They completely destroyed the cities of Galilee. They burned the fields, and then they emptied the land. The people of Zebulun and Naphtali were bound in chains, dragged away from their ancestral homes, and forced into exile in the east. This was the very beginning of the great Jewish exile. Long before the Babylonians ever reached the gates of Jerusalem in the south, the north had already fallen. Galilee was ground zero of Israel's destruction. It was the first part of the Promised Land to be conquered, and the first place to fall into absolute darkness. To replace the exiled Israelites, the Assyrian Empire moved foreign, pagan populations into the empty northern territory. This was the birth of the mixed culture. This is the tragic historical reason why the region became known as the Circle of the Gentiles. It was not because the people of Zebulun and Naphtali willingly abandoned their faith. It was because they were conquered, crushed, and scattered. The Assyrian invasion created a permanent scar on the memory of the nation. From that moment on, the religious elite in the safety of Jerusalem looked at the north and saw a graveyard. They saw a place of historical defeat. They saw a region that had been violently swallowed up by the pagan world. For 700 years, Galilee carried the stigma of this ancient trauma. It was the place where the light of Israel had first been extinguished. It was the place of deepest historical darkness. The religious center assumed God had abandoned the north forever. But the Bible is a book of profound reversals, and God's memory is much longer than human prejudice. God had not forgotten Zebulun and Naphtali. He had not abandoned the broken borders of the north. For centuries, the region was a symbol of hopelessness. The people who lived there were walking in the heavy shadow of an ancient defeat, until a prophet named Isaiah wrote a sentence that shattered the silence. He looked directly at the historic wreckage of Galilee, and he recorded a promise that would eventually change the entire map of history. To understand the magnitude of this prophecy, you have to imagine the environment in which it was written. The prophet Isaiah is writing during a time of national terror. The Assyrian army has just devastated the north. The tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali have been dragged away into exile. The land has been burned, and foreign populations have been moved in to take their place. In the southern capital of Jerusalem, the religious elite are watching this unfold in horror. But they also begin to develop a theology of abandonment. They assume the north is gone forever. They assume that because Zebulun and Naphtali were conquered, God has permanently removed his presence from that geography. The story of those tribes, they believed, was officially over. At the end of Isaiah chapter 8, the text describes this exact historical moment. It speaks of a people who will look toward the earth and see only distress, darkness, and fearful gloom. But then, the scroll rolls into chapter 9, and Isaiah writes a sentence that violently interrupts the despair. He says, "Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress." In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations, by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. Notice what Isaiah is doing. He is not writing a vague spiritual metaphor. He is naming the exact coordinates of the trauma. He is pointing his finger directly at the smoking ruins of the northern border. He does not say that God will simply bless the safety of Jerusalem and make the center even brighter. He says that God is going to return to the darkest, most broken, most humiliating edge of the map, and he is going to crown it with honor. Then, Isaiah writes the words that would echo through the centuries. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. This is not just a poetic phrase. It is the profound biblical architecture of grace. God does not simply ignore the broken margins. He targets them. Where the destruction was the heaviest, the restoration will be the most spectacular. God is establishing a pattern. The light of redemption will not shine down from the religious center. It will dawn up from the historic wreckage. For 700 years, the Jewish people held on to this scroll. They read it in the synagogues. They waited for the light to break over the northern hills. But centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The Assyrians were replaced by the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. And through it all, Galilee remained exactly what it had been, a military buffer zone, a region heavily taxed, deeply oppressed, and viewed by the religious center as a compromised, uneducated wasteland. By the 1st century, the scholars in Jerusalem had largely spiritualized or ignored Isaiah's geographic promise. They were so focused on the temple and so focused on the purity of the holy city that they could not imagine God using the contaminated north for anything genuinely holy. But the prophecy had set a geographical lock on the Messiah. If the true king was going to arrive, he could not launch his rescue mission from the safety of the capital. He could not start his work in the places of assumed perfection. He had to honor the ancient promise. And this is exactly why, 7 centuries later, when Jesus is ready to announce the kingdom of God, he does not go to the marble steps of the temple. He turns his back on the religious establishment. He walks exactly into the shadow. When Jesus finally steps into the public eye to begin his ministry, he makes a highly specific geographic decision. Most readers assume that he simply stayed in his hometown and started preaching. After all, he is known throughout history as Jesus of Nazareth. Nazareth was located in the hills of Galilee. It was a small, deeply obscure village, far away from the halls of power. But the Gospel of Matthew tells us something fascinating. Jesus does not stay in Nazareth. He actually leaves his hometown and intentionally relocates. Matthew chapter 4, verse 13, records the move. It says that leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. And then Matthew explicitly tells us why Jesus made this move. He writes that this happened to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. The land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. Jesus is not just wandering through the north. He is locking his life into the ancient coordinates of the prophecy. He is matching his ministry to the exact pattern of the margin. To understand how profound this is, we have to look closely at his new headquarters. Capernaum was not a quiet, isolated spiritual retreat. It was a bustling, noisy, culturally mixed border town on the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee. More importantly, it sat directly on the Via Maris, the ancient international trade route we looked at earlier. Because it was on this major highway, Capernaum was a major toll station. It had a customs office where taxes were extracted from merchants passing through the region. It also housed a Roman military garrison, overseen by a centurion. To the religious establishment down in Jerusalem, Capernaum was the absolute definition of compromise. It was filled with Roman soldiers, tax collectors, foreign merchants, and rough laborers. It was practically pagan territory. If you were trying to build a movement based on religious purity, Capernaum is the last place on earth you would choose to live. Pause for a second and look at the movement of this story. We started with the assumption that a holy king must launch his kingdom from a holy center. The assumption that God works strictly through the guarded, purified systems of human religion. But the pattern is pulling us in the exact opposite direction. Think about the contrast between the temple in Jerusalem and the town of Capernaum. The temple was static. It was heavily guarded. You had to pass through courts and barriers just to get close to the presence of God. It was built to keep the unclean world out. Capernaum was entirely open. It was a crossroads. By setting up his headquarters in a town with a Roman garrison and a customs house, Jesus is placing his message directly in the path of the world. He does not ask the contaminated world to clean itself up and climb a mountain to find him. He walks down from the mountain and builds his house at the intersection where the world is already walking. He takes the exact region that was the ground zero of Israel's historic exile, the very place where the Assyrians first shattered the nation, and he turns it into the staging ground for the ultimate rescue mission. The place where the darkness first fell is exactly where the light first breaks. This is the intentional headquarters of grace. But a kingdom cannot just have a location. It must have citizens. It must have messengers. Jesus has chosen the geography of the margins. Now, he has to build his inner circle. And because he anchored himself in the shadows of Capernaum, the people he invited to help him change the world were not the people Jerusalem expected. When Jesus moved his headquarters to Capernaum, he was doing more than making a geographic statement. He was setting the stage for the kind of people he would choose to lead his movement. The geography of Galilee perfectly matched the sociology of his disciples. If you are attempting to build a movement that will reform the religious center, the logical strategy is to recruit from the center. You go to Jerusalem. You walk into the rabbinic schools. You find the sharpest young scholars, the men who have spent their entire lives memorizing the Torah and mastering the traditions of the elders. You find men with the right credentials, the right family names, and the right religious polish. Jesus walks right past all of them. He goes to the water. In the first chapter of Mark, we see Jesus walking beside the Sea of Galilee. He sees two brothers, Simon Peter and Andrew, casting a net into the lake. A little farther on, He sees James and John sitting in a boat, preparing their nets. He calls out to them, and they drop everything to follow him. We are so used to this story that we miss how shocking it is. These were not scholars. They were not priests. They were Galilean fishermen. We often picture first-century fishermen as quiet, peaceful men sitting by a calm lake. That is not historical reality. Commercial fishing on the Sea of Galilee was brutal, exhausting labor. These men worked through the night. They dragged heavy, soaked nets by hand. They managed boats in sudden, violent storms. They ran small businesses under the crushing weight of heavy Roman taxation. They were loud, rough, blue-collar workers. Because they were from the north, they were also marked by their speech. History tells us that Galileans had a distinct, heavy accent. They tended to swallow their guttural letters. To the educated elites in the south, the Galilean accent sounded unrefined, uneducated, and slurred. When a Galilean spoke in Jerusalem, everyone immediately knew they were from the wrong side of the map. But these are the men Jesus chooses to be the architects of his church. And the circle only gets more complicated from there. Jesus walks up to a tax booth in Capernaum and calls Matthew. Tax collectors were the ultimate outcasts in Jewish society. They were viewed as traitors who collaborated with the Roman occupation, extracting money from their own neighbors to feed the empire. In the heavily taxed region of Galilee, a tax collector was despised. Then, Jesus adds a man named Simon to his inner circle. Scripture calls him Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were men burning with violent, revolutionary hatred toward Rome. They wanted to overthrow the empire by force. Look at the group Jesus has assembled in the north. He has rough fishermen. He has a tax collector who works for Rome. He has a zealot who hates Rome. None of these men belonged in the temple courts. None of them had the religious resume required by the scribes and the Pharisees. They were the absolute embodiment of the circle of the Gentiles. They were mixed, complicated, overlooked, and entirely uncredentialed. But that is exactly the point. Jesus is taking the historic wreckage of the northern border and using it to build his kingdom. He does not choose finished, polished men from the center of religious power. He chooses ordinary, broken men from the margins. He knows that the men who know they are in the dark are the ones most ready to receive the light. The disciples were the living, breathing proof of Isaiah's ancient prophecy. Jesus was quietly building a kingdom from the outside in. He was gathering power on the edges of the map, filling his movement with the forgotten people of the north. But a kingdom built on the margins cannot stay on the margins forever. As this Galilean movement grew, and as the rough voices of these fishermen began to carry immense spiritual authority, it was only a matter of time before it collided with the center. As the movement grew, the tension became impossible to ignore. Healing, teaching, and immense spiritual authority were flowing out from the northern borders. Crowds were gathering by the thousands. But a kingdom built on the margins cannot stay hidden forever. Eventually, it must face the center. The collision between Galilee and Jerusalem was inevitable. To the religious establishment in the south, Jesus was an absolute scandal. He did not fit any of their categories. He did not ask for their permission. He did not study in their schools, and he did not launch his ministry from their holy city. The Gospel of John reveals just how deep this geographical prejudice ran. In John chapter 1, a man named Philip realizes that Jesus is the promised Messiah. He runs to find his friend Nathanael, and he says, "We have found the one Moses and the prophets wrote about. It is Jesus of Nazareth." Nathanael's response is famous. He asks, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" This was not just a friendly local rivalry. Nathanael was expressing a deeply ingrained theological prejudice. He knew the scriptures. He knew the Messiah was supposed to be a king of royal blood. In his mind, a true king could never emerge from an obscure, uneducated, historically broken village in the north. But Nathanael is not the only one who struggles with this. As the story progresses, the resistance from the religious elites turns hostile. In John chapter 7, the Pharisees and chief priests are desperately trying to find a way to arrest Jesus. One of their own, A man named Nicodemus stands up and gently suggests that they should at least give Jesus a fair hearing before condemning him. The response of the Pharisees is devastating. They turn on Nicodemus and say, "Are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee." Notice what the religious center is doing. They are using geography as a weapon. They are so blinded by their own pride and so certain that God only works through their approved systems that they completely forget the ancient prophecy. They tell Nicodemus to search the scriptures. But if they had searched the scroll of Isaiah carefully, they would have seen the promise. The land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, the Galilee of the Gentiles. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. The center could not accept a salvation that came from the shadows. This tension reaches its terrifying climax during the final week of Jesus' life. Jesus leaves the northern borders and walks directly into Jerusalem. He brings his Galilean movement right to the steps of the temple, and the center responds with absolute violence. During the trial of Jesus, even his followers are targeted because of their geography. When Peter is sitting in the courtyard, trying to hide in the shadows, a servant girl recognizes him. The Gospel of Matthew tells us exactly how he is exposed. The bystanders say to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for your accent betrays you." Even in the dark, the center of power recognized the rough, unpolished sound of the margin. The religious and political authorities join forces. They arrest the Galilean teacher. They mock him, they beat him, and they drag him outside the walls of the holy city to crucify him. To the priests and scribes, the cross was the end of the Galilean threat. They had protected the center. They had silenced the uncredentialed prophet from the north. They assumed that the light which had dawned in the darkness was finally and permanently extinguished. But the pattern of Galilee was not finished. The story does not end in a tomb outside Jerusalem. And surprisingly, when the resurrection happens, the final command of Jesus does not keep the disciples in the holy city. He sends them back to the shadows. The morning of the resurrection changes the entire fabric of the universe. The tomb is empty. Death has been defeated. The light has finally and permanently conquered the darkness. If you are writing a standard heroic narrative, this is the moment of ultimate vindication. Where should the resurrected king appear to claim his victory? The logical answer is the temple. You walk directly into the courts. You stand before the high priest. You show your scars to the scribes and the Pharisees who condemned you. You seize the center of religious power and prove them all wrong. But Jesus does not do that. He does not show himself to the religious establishment. He does not linger to conquer the holy city. He does not perform miraculous signs for the men who demanded his execution. Instead, he gives his closest friends a completely unexpected set of marching orders. In Matthew chapter 28, the women arrive at the empty tomb. An angel appears and gives them a highly specific message for the disciples. He says, "He has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him." Moments later, Jesus himself meets the women on the road, and he repeats the exact same instructions. He says, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." This is a profound geographic detail. It is not just a convenient meeting point. Jesus is actively pulling his disciples out of the religious center. Jerusalem has become a place of hostility, of closed doors, of guarded religious systems. Jesus tells them to leave it behind. He sends them back to the north, back to the borders, back to the very place where their journey began. He makes them walk the long road back to the circle of the Gentiles, back to the Roman outposts, the mixed populations, and the busy trade routes. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. Think about the emotional weight of this return. They are back in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. They are looking out over the water where they used to drag heavy nets. They are back in the historic wreckage of the northern border, the exact place Isaiah promised the ancient light would dawn. And it is here, standing on an unnamed mountain in the margins, that Jesus gives them the final, sweeping mandate of his ministry. He says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. We call this the Great Commission. But we often miss how perfectly the geography matches the theology of the command. You cannot launch a mission to all nations from a closed, isolated religious fortress. You launch it from the crossroads. You launch it from the place where the nations are already walking. Jesus takes them back to the overlooked, broken edge of the map, and he points outward. He is saying, the kingdom does not belong to the elite. It does not stay locked in Jerusalem. It bleeds out to the ends of the earth. By ending the Gospel of Matthew in Galilee, the text completes a massive biblical pattern. The movement that started in the deepest darkness is now being sent out to be the light of the world. But this geographic pattern is not just ancient history. It leaves us with a final, unavoidable reality about the nature of grace and how God still chooses to build his kingdom today. We have traced a single geographic pattern across hundreds of years of biblical history, from the terrifying Assyrian invasion that shattered the northern tribes to the ancient promise of Isaiah shining into the wreckage. From the moment Jesus turned his back on Jerusalem to build his headquarters in a Roman toll town, to the morning he sent his uneducated disciples back to the water to receive their final mission. When you look at all of these moments together, a profound theological reality emerges. Galilee is not just a place on a map. It is the architecture of grace. Human religion always gravitates toward the center. We want to build walls, establish credentials, and protect our purity. We instinctively believe that to be used by God, we must be flawless. We think we have to climb the holy mountain, clean ourselves up, and present our most polished, unbroken selves to heaven. We assume that if there is a dark, compromised, or painful area in our history, God cannot possibly be working there. But the story of the northern border proves that God does not operate the way human religion does. He does not wait for us in the pristine halls of the temple. He does not demand that we fix our own historical trauma before he arrives. He walks directly into the shadow. The pattern of Galilee teaches us that God's greatest work almost never begins in the places where we feel the strongest. It begins in the places where we are the most broken. Think about what it meant for Jesus to choose Capernaum. He bypassed the scholars who thought they had nothing left to learn, and he went to the fishermen who knew they were empty. He bypassed the priests who believed they were perfectly clean, and he went to the tax collectors who knew they were compromised. The kingdom of God does not expand from places of assumed perfection. It expands from places of acknowledged need. The people walking in darkness are the ones most ready to see a great light. And this is not just a geographic reality about the first century. It is the entire message of the gospel. The incarnation itself, the moment God became human, is the ultimate Galilean movement. Jesus left the absolute, perfect center of heaven, and he stepped into the deepest, darkest margin of a broken world. He did not shout instructions from the safety of the throne. He came down to the dirt. He came to the crossroads, where humanity was already walking, carrying its wounds, its compromises, and its ancient defeats. He met us on the edge of the map. If you are looking at your own life, and all you see is a history of failure, or a deeply compromised border, or a scar from an old trauma, you are not disqualified from the grace of God. You are in the exact location where he prefers to begin. The light does not shine down from the religious center. It dawns up from the historic wreckage. That is where he builds his kingdom. That is where he calls his followers. And that is where he sends us out to change the world. If this journey through Scripture has helped you see the Bible with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss our next deep dive into the Word. The geography of Jesus was never just a background detail. The pattern was never just a pattern. It was the quiet architecture of redemption